Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at classicstoday.com. I did a video a little bit ago about how violinists do nothing but fetch about how badly the great composers write for their instruments. And the ensuing discussion was fabulous. I want to thank all of you for participating. There was so much intelligent back and forth and dialogue. I just think the comments are much better than my videos. I really do. You guys are amazing. I learned so much about violin technique, about some of the issues involved, about people's perspectives as professional and amateur musicians. I mean, I was flabbergasted. It was phenomenal. So I really want to thank all of you for joining in and participating in that. And that leads to a bit of a sequel, however, because I don't want to create a war between violinists and pianists because, it's stupid, isn't it? I mean, they're amazing instruments with fabulous repertoire and, people who write for them are geniuses. There's no point in having any sort of acrimony. And there wasn't any. But there are some interesting kind of issues that came out of the discussion that I'd like to explore a little further. And if you want to join me, oh my, you're welcome. You're really welcome. And the issue is this. It sounds funny, but in a way it's true, which is that the piano is male and the violin is female. Now, this is a politically charged issue today, but there's a sense in which, let's put it this way, difficulties on the piano are regarded by pianists not with sort of sniffy annoyance, but rather as challenges to be overcome. There is a machismo attached to piano playing, probably because a lot of it involves brute force. It's a cruder instrument. The violin is supple and sophisticated. It's had a settled technique for hundreds of years before the piano was invented. It really requires much more in the way of sensitivity than the piano does. And I know people are going to say piano going to have endless sensitivity of touch and blah, 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 blah. Yeah, okay, fine. Yes, it does. But the piano basically is a one timbre instrument. In other words, you're stuck with what the instrument does. It's built a certain way. It's mechanical. The violin has infinite shades of color. And these are the differences. So I don't want to have, a fight about that stuff. But so the people who play them are neurotically attuned to sort of a different standard. The piano is percussive. The piano is mostly an accompaniment instrument in many respects. Yes, solo piano music, you get a tune, okay, fine. But essentially, keyboards accompany people. That's what they were for. The violin is the melody instrument. It's a soprano. It is the highest female voice. It has feminine characteristics. And all of this was able to be discussed much more frankly about 100, 200 years ago than it is now. Because today everything is like, just politically loaded. But if we just have a simple, frank discussion about it, I think that what I'm saying is pretty true. Most of the pianists I know, and it doesn't matter whether they're male or female, have that machismo element. They like being virtuosos. They want to surmount difficulties. If they see something that's awkward or ridiculous, it's a challenge, and they relish it as often as not. And the truth of the matter is, I just make one point, that if a composer is really incompetent in writing for either instrument or writes passages that are simply unplayable, then performers of both stripes just simplify them. They fake them. I mean, Alicia de la Rocha gave an entire masterclass on how to fake Rachmaninoff if you have small hands. I mean, there are lots of things. Performers are altering things all the time for convenience. But there is that aspect of the piano repertoire. And of course, it's also an incontestable truth that there's a lot more good music written for the keyboard than there is for the violin. Because the violin, I think, is a much more difficult instrument to write for, and because many more composers were keyboardists rather than violinists. I mean, this is just a fact. And the violinists who wrote virtuoso stuff for themselves exclusively did not always write the best music. That is an absolute incontestable fact. But I really think it was very interesting in this discourse that we had to see how the pianists were like, yeah, pedal to the metal. The violinists were like, oh, this is so annoying. This is so difficult. And it's also a question of where does the annoyance happen? You know, in piano writing, the annoyance is seldom a function of playing the tune. It's all about accompanimental figurations and chords and like using all your fingers at once and leaps and jumps and skips and things like that can be quite difficult on the piano. With the violin, it can be a function of what the violin is supposed to be doing, playing the melody. Passage work, I mean, virtuoso fiddling, that's... Yeah, I mean, in that respect, violinists can be just like pianists. It's like, oh, I got to do this passage. Wow, it's fabulous. But having difficulty with the actual tune that you're supposed to be able to simply give yourself up to artistically and sing, well, that's, again, it's a question of, where the incompetence or the difficulty arises in terms of the technique as applied to the instrument in question. But to my original point that pianos are male and violins are female, or at least bisexual, there is an absolutely fabulous quotation, which I've talked about before, but it was a video that I'm sure none of you saw. It was called the Vibrato Monologues. It was a paper that I gave at the American Musicological Society about the sexual politics of vibrato performance on stringed instruments. It's really, actually, I think, a very, very fun talk because it's got quotations from, the literature going back a couple hundred years, and, people talking about how instruments have sexual qualities. And it's just hilarious. You can look it up if you want. It was called the Vibrato Monologues. And if you put it in the search feature in my homepage, it'll pop up. But there is a book called Old Violins by a guy named Reginald Hugh Haweis, I think was his name, R.H. Haweis. He was a reverend, and he wrote about music. He was a loon. He was a complete loon, and it's fabulous what he says here. In this book, Old Violins, he talks about the history of the violin and great violin making and whatnot. And there is a section called Violin Constitution, which begins with one of the best opening sentences I have ever seen in my life, in any written anything. He writes, one of the subtle charms of the violin is that it may be called bisexual. Well, he's writing this in 1905. And that, the term was not as charged, I think, as it later became. He's thinking of it in a more elevated philosophical sense. But then you read on, and it starts to get kind of hot and heavy. So I want you to hear this passage, which I just think is fabulous. So, one of the subtle charms of the violin is that it may be called a bisexual. It unites in itself and welds together the masculine and feminine qualities. Its very fabric is bisexual. The soft, easily moved vibrations of the swelling front are controlled, checked, and yet excited by the slower and harder pulsations of the maple back. The porous deal and the close-grained maple or sycamore thus thrill together, and each supplies the deficiency of the other, both blending in harmonious and sympathetic union, the ribs welding the back and the belly into an organic whole, whilst the sound post, poetically called by the French the soul of the violin, l'âme du violon, collects the quick and slow vibrations, and fusing them produces the subtle resultant of violin tone. That tone is the offspring of neither front nor back, nor ribs alone, but of all these differently vibrating surfaces collected and made musical in the soul, and poured forth as the breath of life from the little F-shaped holes, the F holes, as out of the very mouth and nostrils of the violin. Surely the children of the violin are nothing but the sweet and subtly compounded sounds that it utters. The bisexual figure holds good. He's not giving it up, folks. The bisexual figure holds good even to the bow and strings. The bow is the male, and the strings are the female elements. They can only vibrate when touched, swept into a tempest of emotion, or caressed into tender whispers. They wait and pine for this magic touch and long for their own fulfillment. They are so sensitive that they respond to the lightest feathery kiss of the powdered and anointed horsehair. They murmur, they sigh, they scream, they weep, they laugh, but only when smitten, coaxed, or agonized, sometimes almost torn, at others calmly and masterfully swept, whilst the fingertips, pressing out the vibrations and generating those magnetic thrills which go forth, charged with the musician's very thought and feeling, aid and abet the masculine power of the bow. They are its ministers. Without them, the might of the bow itself would be impotent. God, without them, the very strings would be unable to yield their infinite variety of tone and inflection of meaning. Yes, certainly the violin is, of all instruments, the most human, personal, and sympathetic, for the violin is truly bisexual. Okay. This is perhaps the most extreme example of a body of literature which sexualized instruments and treated the violin as largely feminine, and treated, doing vibrato on the violin as a female weakness. And that is one of the reasons why it was so controversial, because, of course, most musicians were male. And, the biggest compliment they could pay a female violinist was that she played like a man. And and they did not want to be seen as effeminate because they were musicians. Musicians generally were seen as effeminate back in the 19th century. It was a thing. It was an issue. I mean, musicians were not held in terribly high regard for most of our history, and so people caressing the violin, you didn't want to be too ladylike. You really didn't. But there is, even today, in this discourse on the contrast between piano and violin, this feeling that the piano is a big, bold hirsute, muscular. I mean, look at it. It fills up a room. It's a enormous object, and the violin is a much more feminine instrument. And is that coming out? This is my question. Is this essential conception, the distinction, the sexual distinction between the two instruments, coming out in the way that their players talk about them? I think it does. I think it really does. I mean, when pianists reach, difficult passages, they tend to get excited. Violinists tend to get sniffy. Most pianists are not going to say, Brahms didn't know how to write for the piano, because a lot of his piano writing is extremely awkward, and it's awkward in ways that you don't hear. It's not awkward in a virtuoso way. It's awkward in terms of hand positions and, things like that. Or Rachmaninoff, who had, the left hand from hell. He could reach like a 15th or something, and giant sucker-like fingers. And, and so his left hand parts are like unplayable for people who aren't Rachmaninoff. I mean, they sort of have fun with it. They really do. But violinists get morally offended at the way, the great composers could write for the violin in a way which is awkward or difficult. They feel as though they're being insulted personally. And it's a very, very interesting thing. in our musical life. We can take, of course, the sexual element out of it. We're just having a little bit of fun, in that regard. But there is definitely a difference in attitude. Definitely a difference in attitude. I remember, watching some videos about the Liszt Mephisto Waltz #1. And you know the passage, right? The octaves from hell, towards, 2/3 or so of the way through. And to watch the way that this was taught by piano students, and piano students spoke of it, it was interesting. Very, very interesting, because, they were like, well, either you can do it or you can't. You'll either make it or you won't. You just have to fearlessly dive in and go for it. Whereas when you look at violin tutorials and things like that, they're like, well, this wasn't terribly well written, and you have to think about it. It's very, very interesting to me. And it's one of those aspects of musical life that if you're a professional musician or a busy amateur musician, as I was for many, many years, you run into them. It's really, really interesting. I remember vividly, one of the most entertaining moments I had was when we were doing Dandy's Symphony on a French Mountain Air. I've told this story before, and we had this hotshot Russian pianist from Manhattan School who was going to play the solo part. And the Symphony on a French Mountain Air is fabulous. It's a wonderful piece, and it's very, very difficult for the soloist, but it's not a concerto. It's a concertante symphony is what it is. It's a symphony with piano obbligato, but that doesn't make it easy. Even though the piano does a lot of accompanying, it's concerto length and it's concerto difficulty. It really is. So this guy, thought he was going to just breeze in and play through the thing. And then, like 2 weeks before the concert, he actually looked at the music and realized he couldn't play it. Couldn't play it at all. He couldn't learn it. So he quit, and we were screwed. We were stuck. And fortunately, we found a splendid French music scholar and pianist who is still teaching, actually, at I believe at CUNY Staten Island. She runs the graduate center there. Sylvia Kahan is her name. Hello, Sylvia, who has since become a dear friend. And Sylvia is this petite, shall we say, short lady with teeny tiny hands. And she just played the living crap out of it. She just came in and she just, it was fantastic. So it has nothing to do with the sex of the player. It has to do with mental attitude. With mental, she loves French music. That's her field. She loves the work. And it was, it was difficult for everybody. It's hard to play, but she was wonderful. That's the difference, really. It's very, very, very interesting. We had a concertmaster on the other hand, in the same orchestra, who was, oh my God, was he a prima donna? He was absolutely unbelievable. And he was one of those guys who thought that the violin was the be-all and end-all of music, and that composers didn't know how to write for it, and they weren't worthy of him. Eventually, we had to get rid of him because it was just impossible to work with him. He was also having an affair with the trombonist, who was female. He was male. He was as macho as they come, by the way, from a sexual point of view. But he had such attitude about the violin and about how important he was, and how the lack of need to rehearse or to do these things that were too easy and that were beneath him. It's a very, very interesting thing. Anyway, so there you are. I just think that the two instruments have very different psychological prerequisites. And it could be that the sensitivity and attitude, if you want to call it that, prima donna-ishness that we see in so many violinists is in fact part and parcel of what it takes to play an instrument with the necessary sensitivity. It's just there. There are psychological aspects to performance, to instrumental performance that we don't usually consider. We only care about whether they play the notes or don't play the notes. But yeah, It's an interesting topic. So again, I want to thank all of you for participating in that earlier conversation. And if you have any further thoughts, feel free to share them because, oh gosh, that was fun. Anyway, and I'm selfish that way. I like having fun. I really do. And I feel as though you're doing more work than I am. So it's even better. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.